On the assessing the principles, I don't think the principles of independence and neutrality can be assessed, because I think they are fundamentally about perceptions and making sure that the perceptions are what we need to achieve the aim. I think that the results of impartiality can be measured, as we've shown, but I think it has to be done in a very subtle way, as I said earlier, which takes into account the context. So it's not a yes or no meeting, yes or no. And I think it's, again, the whole issue of the level at which we're looking. So, for example, when we were looking at measuring the principle of impartiality, and we were looking at the global allocation of resources that an organization has, the point that Mark made earlier, how do you make sure that as an organization you are not constrained by what resources you are able to fundraise to be able to respond to a crisis. And I think it's about having mechanisms in place which enable you to have an overview of needs at constantly across the planet, and to actually be in a position to decide where you want to allocate your resources independently from what's available at that moment in time. So I do think that the principle of impartiality can be assessed with certain caveats, and I think that the core humanitarian standard, which has recently been launched, is definitely looking at the principle of impartiality at the level of a project, and that's very clear. It's not looking at it beyond the level of a project, but it's looking at it at the level of the project. And I would say, from my perspective, that having it there already will hopefully be an incentive for organizations to start looking at it more globally, to start setting up the framework that we've discussed.
I come down the side of they can be assessed, but under the general principle, to quote a former U.S. Supreme Court judge, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And there is a way in which that leads to a relativism, but there's also a way in which actually you could get a lot of people around on many of these aspects to say, no, that violates it. I really think that there are things, if you're taking money from a belligerent party in a war zone, I think there are aspects that can be assessed. I think there are aspects of the independence. I agree with Kate that the perception is in some ways the important thing, but at the same time, that doesn't mean you can't measure your actual independence in certain ways and your actual neutrality in certain ways. Maybe not all aspects of it. If you are leaking aid into a militarized area, and you know that it is being sold and traded and things like that, you might not be able to measure it in detail, but you can understand that has implications for your neutrality. So I do think that there are, even if we couldn't measure all the aspects of all the principles, how do you quantify humanity? There are lots of ways in which you can measure. I think this is the false argument, that because you can't measure it perfectly, we shouldn't measure it. And I think that there are plenty of organizations that could do a lot better job looking at themselves and saying, we haven't, we're being very pragmatic, you might say, in accepting this money or in doing something that we know is in violation of the principles.
On the issue of can we, should we, will we, I think it is important that we try to measure better whether we're being principled. I think we now operate in a $100 billion industry, and the idea that, some or particularly lots of this money is being misapplied in incredibly complex and violent context is a terrifying thought. And so I do think that we should be trying to assess better whether or not we're doing the right thing, whether the way we're operating is actually assisting those in need. Having said that, I don't think we can do it perfectly, but we can assess perceptions as well. So I don't think it all has to be quantifiable. So I think there are assessments that we can do. I think there are reviews that we can do. I think we could be much better at doing peer reviewing, learning from each other. I think also on the issue of impartiality, I think we could do much more at every level on impartiality, but I think fundamental to that would be a much better investment in needs assessment. And I think it's one thing we haven't talked about is we need to get better at understanding needs at a global level and at a specific project level in order to be able to do a much stronger impartial assessment of where the needs are and where we should be responding. Having said all that, I think some of this is a bit like Weight Watchers. We do want people to weigh in and to be willing to stand on that weighing scales and to look at that weight in the face. And if we're constantly, banging the rule book over people's heads and questioning whether or not we're being principled, the idea that people will step up and have these frank discussions and talk about these difficult dilemmas, I think it needs to be put in the balance. While at the one hand, I do think we need to do more to assess and to be critical. At the other hand, I think we also need to focus more on, whether or not the principles are relevant, how they can be helpful, because I think it is a balancing act. At the moment, I think we're not doing enough introspection on where we've gone wrong, but also about where we've gone right. And so I think that balance is important.
How to, sort of deal with this continuum is, it is very, very clear that the old box of humanitarian over here and development over here is just wrong. And there's a continuum, and even the continuum is a bit funny because in a place like, for instance, Eastern DRC, you've got all of it. It's not a continuum at all. It's a checkerboard where there are elements of crisis and elements of developmental and everything in between. And there are some fundamental contradictions there. And, I think you used the word seamless. These organizations manage these seamlessly. And I don't see multi-mandate organizations doing that. I see, this floor is the humanitarian floor, and that floor is the development floor, and the funding and the budgets, and, they meet in a lunchroom. But otherwise, there are quite some differences. And I think those differences arise out of the very, very real way in which, for instance, we were talking earlier that to be a good development organization, let's say in the UK, an organization might host one of the political parties, might in some ways try and become a partner with a government in order to advance long-term developmental goals and advocacy goals and things like that, campaigning goals. And all that's understandable, but at the same time then, when you're in a war zone, in a conflict area, and that, how does that work in terms of the perception of your independence? And I really don't have an answer, except to say that I think the answer is to just make sure that you're debating these things. And to really make sure, I think, for instance, in MSF, we are too long in a place with solely the humanitarian hat on and not recognizing that actually this is there's a lot of developmentalness about this setting, and we need to have some give on some of these principles once you start getting into a different stage, because the idea in the end that they are pragmatic it means that when there are different stages and different things actually happening in a given context, you have to adjust.
On the issue of the continuum, I think it's incredibly difficult. And I think, within the Red Cross, that largely focuses more on emergency response. We do have the luxury somewhat of being able to apply the principles. I think it's incredibly difficult for organisations that do have to operate along that continuum. And going back to that issue of legacy, about how they do respond on the basis of need and in accordance with the principles when they have been operating at a different time on a development basis. I think it's extraordinarily challenging. So I don't know what the answer is to that. At the same time, I think diversity is incredibly important. I think it's great that MSF can build up a reservoir of funding so that they can respond immediately. But I think they can do it if every other organisation followed the same model, then MSF wouldn't be able to do it. And we do need a diversity of actors. And so I don't have an answer to that, to be honest. But I think it is incredibly challenging for multi-mandate organisations. I think it doesn't matter. I think it doesn't matter to the person in Aleppo if they're getting assistance from somewhere. I think the reason why we're talking about this in terms of us and not in terms of the person is because, from my point of view, these are tools for us to be the organisations that can provide assistance in Aleppo. And I see them as ways of getting there. And so I see the person as very much at the end of this journey. I see the object of this as providing assistance to people in need, and to be able to sustain that over the long term. And so that's why I think this is important. But fundamentally, no, I don't think it matters, or at least it doesn't matter in the very immediate term to someone whose life is in danger if someone is giving them assistance. It may matter over a longer term basis if they're able to choose between different actors whether that assistance is aligned or not to one party to a conflict, for instance. And so I think, coming back to that issue of diversity, I think it's also important that there is a role for organisations that aren't neutral. I think some organisations gain access by very virtue of the fact that they're not neutral, because they are aligned, and they're granted that access because a military actor sees them as part of their military effort, or they are in some way in solidarity with a certain group and not another. And I think there's a role for that. I just don't think that there's a role for international in particular, but also national actors that want to provide assistance on the basis of need to those who need it most, and to do that over the long term, and to be accepted across territories that may be divided, that may be diverse. And so I think we're talking about how we get to do that, and that's the business aspect of that. But I very much see the person as the object in all of this.
Maybe to start off with Tamam's point about, how do you look at these, and do we actually measure whether these principles, have meaning to those who are getting the aid? I think one of the hardest parts about that is that it would be hard to impossible to do that in the present, but then also to think about it over time. Meaning, if you take a hardline principled stand today that essentially requires you to withdraw or reduce your aid, okay, you could probably in some ways measure that, okay, now you are no longer aiding these people because you've taken a principled stand. But how would you measure the degree to which taking that principled stand today opens up and allows you to argue in the future and maintain access, as opposed to, getting booted out of Sudan in 2009, saying very little, and then having a lot of other governments going, wow, we thought we'd get more noise and more, we thought it would be harder to kick out an organization like MSF. What does that mean in terms of your access? So it's not even just assessing it in the present, it's long term. I think the question of does it matter to those who you serve isn't as important. I think the answer there is no, it probably doesn't. I think it matters to those you don't serve. I think that when you have organizations who receive large amounts of funding to do something, and they simply look for needs, as opposed to communities who are most in need, I think that makes a difference. And I think when for instance, a situation like the Haiti earthquake, where you have organizations working on a long-term developmental perspective with a constituency, and when humanitarian aid comes in and it essentially is then distributed to your constituency, that really changes the character of that aid. And in some ways then, the allegiance and participation in development becomes an insurance policy where you will receive humanitarian assistance first, based on your affiliation with an organization. And I think those are dangerous roads to go down. So I think that placing some emphasis on most in need, there is a difference between finding people who are needy and finding those who are most in need, and just getting that out there, I think it's something that people understand. Of course people are selfish, but at the same time, if you explain, look, today those people are they're starving worse, but tomorrow it might be you, and that's why we'd be here. I think people get that, but you need to talk about it with people. You can't just drive by people who are in need and expect them to understand why you're doing that.
As you were talking, I was remembering an example from South Sudan quite a long time ago, where the food aid operation targeted displaced communities who were principally women and children, and who were not being covered by the social safety net system that was distributed through chiefs, because they didn't belong, because they were displaced and they didn't belong to that community. And the realization that if instead of targeting the most needy, we had actually provided assistance through the chief, the most needy would have received less, but they would have been integrated as part of a social safety responsibility, and we would have put them in a position where they were much more able to deal with the longer-term situation that they were under than the short-term. So again, I mean, principles are a framework and they're a guide. And it's not about, it's really about understanding exactly what makes a difference at that moment. But having that dialogue with the chiefs as to making sure that they understood that they were receiving this assistance because they had the responsibility of these disenfranchised communities was absolutely essential, and hopefully could contribute in the longer term to actually a local system of sustainable system of safety net being developed.
Well, thank you. I would be foolish to try and sum up, and I'm not. I'm many things, but I'm not that foolish. But what I've been doing is writing down words as we've articulated them, and I've written down the importance of debate, internal reflection and introspection, which is often ironic because we often talk of the need to look outwards. I've written down calling it as it is, consistency, honesty, the use of these principles as tools, cutting through decision-making, common references, embedding, highlighting or showcasing times when it works, peer referencing, wider context, structure, legacy, us talking about us, and the person at the centre. And I think that's probably enough to allow you to go now and have a drink, have a nibble, continue your discussions. I think part of the whole aim of this event is to start the discussion, to raise a few points as I think we have had great fortune from the very, very, I would say, erudite panel here who've thought about it a lot. So please join with me in thanking them, and do enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.